Good morning. My name is Jack Zephyr, and I am with the Ronnie K. Arani Center for Energy Solutions. This is our monthly webinar series called Energy Talks. The talk today is going to be focused on discussing energy ESG leadership. So the sub-question there is, what are some actionable strategies to lead an organization which is working on becoming compliant with ESG principles? So we're grateful for the opportunity to share our thoughts this morning and the thoughts of three of our colleagues. First, the Arani Center for Energy Solutions is an institution within Mewburn College of Earth and Energy at the University of Oklahoma, and we're focused on kind of three main efforts. The first is providing experiential learning opportunities for our students. The second is offering relevant professional development opportunities for energy professionals. And third is engaging with the community on key industry topics. This discussion kind of touches all three of those efforts. Our larger vision is to provide greater opportunity for all. And this is partly realized by working with industry to produce reliable, affordable, and sustainable energy for all. And all includes both producers and consumers of energy, as well as energy industry participants and the communities in which we all live and work. With me today are David Stewart, Wendy Kirchhoff, and Josh Zier. David and Josh are both with Project Canary, a data analytics and environmental assessment company committed to accelerating the path of the energy industry to net zero energy production. David is the Vice President of Environmental Solutions and Regulatory Affairs, and Josh is the Head of Certification at Project Canary. Wendy is the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, Regulatory Policy and ESG at the American Exploration and Production Council, which is a national trade association representing 28 oil and natural gas exploration and production companies, including most of the large independents in the United States. So first, let's talk about ESG and what it is and where it came from. It's worth noting that all four of us at one point in our careers, we've been on the upstream side of oil and gas production going back 15 plus years. And during that time, by nature of the business that we're in, it's a competitive business, we were all probably focused on continuous improvement. And much of that continuous improvement effort was focused on environmental health and safety matters. So Wendy, I would say it seems like the industry over the last 15 years, at least for me to date myself, it seems like the industry was becoming more committed to what became known as ESG before any of us had even heard the acronym. So what's new about it and what's not new?
Well, I agree. And I think you and I talked about this a little bit when we did sort of a background get together on this, having my roots in sort of policy making in DC on, Capitol Hill, having worked on energy policy for a long time, and then coming into a company, I had never heard, 20 years ago, that term ESG in sort of the policy space, despite having worked on a lot of federal energy policy at the time. Coming into an operator, an upstream independent, I met sort of the ESG team and had learned that this discipline had been around for a long time. But as I kind of started to peel back the layers of the onion, I realized that at the root of this is just risk management. And it had been something that energy industries and many industries have been doing for a long time. It maybe didn't have this name, and maybe disclosure in a public sphere has grown over the years. But the root of it is really just risk management for the business. Back then, I think everybody called it sustainability practices. But it's really, how do you mitigate these risks to your business so that you can have a sustainable business midterm and long term? And so, that's what's nice, is it's really rooted into what we do. This industry has always been a high-tech industry. They've always been on a path seeking continuous improvement. and innovation, and in many of these spaces. But putting it under this banner of ESG and getting a lot more sunlight on it, people are getting more familiar with a lot of the work that our member companies have been doing for decades.
And David and Josh, I think a similar question for you guys. As you are working with industry and working with your client companies to accelerate their movement towards net zero, I mean, what do you see as just an augmentation of what we've already been doing, or what is truly new about ESG?
Would you like me to go first?
Yep.
All right, I'll take the first stab at this. So I view ESG as a differentiator. It's something that gets utilized unilaterally across the industry, but at the same time, it's not approached equally by every operator or every individual. So ESG can be used as a tool to leverage really a tool to leverage some of these environmental initiatives that certain operators are implementing. It can be used as a differentiating factor as it relates to things like capital markets. If you want to talk about something that's definitely changed recently, and Jack, I apologize if I'm getting ahead of schedule here. I mean, access to capital is at the forefront of many, many things right now. And ESG is going to be a part of that. I'm pretty sure that's going to be a fact. I would label that not as an opinion. But ESG can be used as a differentiator to really separate operators in the industry who take operational excellence and environmental stewardship above just the status quo or what the minimum expectations are.
Okay, so a differentiator. And then at the field level, what do you see as changing, or what do you see as remaining the same?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one, Jack. I think a lot of things have been going on in this industry for a very long time. We've been controlling emissions consistently for 15, 20 years. It's just hyper-focused on ESG. It's going to continue to drive the technical improvements in the industry. We've seen tremendous advances in things like storage tank vapor controls, vapor recovery units, glycol dehydration, still vent controls. I could go on and on. There's just so many technologies that the industry has developed to control emissions better and produce less emissions while at the same time producing more oil and gas for the nation. So it's just been a tremendous honor and exciting time in my life to experience all these changes in the industry and see the progress that we've made. One of the things you can always be guaranteed of when you present the oil field with a challenge, they're going to rise to it, and they're going to exceed your expectations with every technology. And this hyper focus on ESG is just the next challenge that we're all going to have to face. And I am very confident that we're going to make tremendous progress in the coming years.
I love that, David. We are a resilient bunch because we have to be through the kind of vicissitudes of the market cycles, which, as we all know, can be pretty nasty.
Yeah.
So kind of collectively, we as an industry, we are always focused on continuous improvement. Much of what we have been doing now falls under the banner of ESG. And so there's the aspect of this that is now a reporting requirement. So, we have to put more effort into talking about what we are doing to produce energy reliably, affordably, and sustainably, and make sure that external stakeholders, some of whom are outside of the kind of the framework of the industry, so that is disclosed to them. So it sounds like part of ESG, and maybe a majority of it is about disclosing our activities so that people can see our transparency. Wendy, on the regulatory side, on the policy side, what new disclosures are we going to have to make?
Well, and I think, we just received a proposal this week from the SEC that would expand the required disclosure. And so I think that debate, we are still reviewing the policy. The debate still has to play out as to what that will fundamentally become. Historically, those disclosures are really about providing the investors and the market information that it needs to make those decisions, in particularly how risks are identified and how they've been managed. In a sort of parallel vein, this drive towards voluntary disclosure in the ESG space has grown also to kind of satisfy, I think, investor interest. I think Josh is right. People who have been able to use ESG disclosures to help differentiate themselves because they're always custom. Your sustainability solutions are going to be fit for purpose for your business, and so even if both of your companies are doing above the minimum, their ESG could look very differently because it's going to be custom fit for their businesses. And so what you're starting to see with this SEC proposal is an interest in sort of blurring those lines from voluntary disclosure about environmental and sustainability practices, and then trying to couple that with securities disclosure. And so how that's going to look in the end, I think is still yet to play out. No doubt, as David said, that, there's a hyper focus right now on these ESG disclosures. Putting them under a securities law does change things about them. It may actually discourage some of the behavior that I think ESG has traditionally encouraged as a way to differentiate, because now you're having securities liabilities attached to things. So I don't have a good answer for that other than what is being proposed, which is certainly more disclosure on things under a security banner for things like emissions, scenarios, pricing scenarios, or other climate risk evaluation scenarios, how you are managing and evaluating those risks as far as your governance strategy, and more transparency on how you're going to achieve a target if you disclose one. The challenge of that is a lot of people have historically done these things aspirationally. And if I now have to disclose something I had intended to be aspirational and I don't know how I'm going to get there yet, now this has teeth and I may not be able to go down that path anymore. So I think the conversations are still in flux as far as how required disclosures are going to change as a result of the policy proposals that were issued this week.
Jack, can I build on that? Okay, thanks. Wendy, I appreciate everything you said. I think it's spot on. I think it's going to be a two-faced approach to where transparency, and I think forward-thinking companies view it this way too. Transparency is merely step one. Being transparent with the data long-term is not going to be enough. What is going to be enough is when it's acted upon. I think companies, and I think this is what Wendy was alluding to at the end of her comment there was, when you make these aspirational goals, your investors, your stakeholders are going to want to see your progress toward that. So I think transparency is merely step one, and that's what regulation may drive. The action, the actual movement on these objectives, that's step two, and that's going to be the bigger one for these companies to execute on.
Yeah, I think I want to emphasize one thing Wendy said a little more, and that's the fact that this SEC rule is really going to change people's goals, and they probably will not publish as lofty goals as they otherwise would have. And I think that's really important because when companies reach out there, they're looking at their risk, and this SEC rule really does increase their risk exponentially with regards to any goal setting and meeting those goals. I don't think it's a horrible thing to have an SEC rule around reporting, but the fact is, reporting, there's no standards right now, and so it's very difficult to go and enforce whatever they come up with. So we're operating under a number of standards, and Project Canary is really in a position to provide this standard through our Trust Well and our environmental assessment process. So there is standardization occurring in the industry through a number of different organizations, and I think it's a work in progress, but it has a long ways to go. So we just got to be careful before we enforce. Let's get the methodology down correctly, so we're all shooting from the same playing field. And I think that's just really important with regards to the structure of how things are reported. Not only the transparency, but what is reported, how is it backed up by data?
Thank you. So it sounds like there might be some unintended consequences on the disclosure side by the SEC rule. It is all dynamic. Wendy, you mentioned earlier, you don't have a good answer for this. I don't think any of us do, because things are changing so quickly when it comes to defining ESG and how or what the principles are and how we're going to comply with them. What I would be curious about, so stepping aside from the disclosure conversation, and that applies mostly to public companies, right? But if we just focus on private and public companies, so the energy industry, for those that want to kind of embed ESG principles into their business, what's the best way to start, right? So, what's driving the changes, and how do we move past step one and towards step two, using the words that Josh used?
Sure. And I guess since we're in the spirit of this debate, I may lob some questions out for Project Canary, because I have some questions around this space as well, of how would this play out when you fundamentally change the drivers for some of these reporting, and it's harder to distinguish yourself through greater transparency in ESG if it's required and everybody's having to do it. And the drivers, of course, for a private company will be different than a public company. And so kind of playing those scenarios out, I think, could have some unintended consequences, or certainly change some of the playing field that we want to, that is worth thinking through. But as far as your initial question, Jack, if you're going to, where this is going as far as companies starting to design in the ability for robust ESG disclosures into their business, given that risk management has always been fundamental, it's really kind of the disclosure part that has grown and sort of pushing the technology. What we're seeing is, most oil and gas companies, fundamentally, all of you, I'm sure, will be familiar with this, when it comes to environmental health and safety, they will have operational practices, they will call it management systems, right? And so you'll have operational excellence management systems, or environmental management systems, safety management systems. Your service companies have them, your oil and gas companies have them, that really govern your practices to provide sort of a standard of performance and health, safety, and environmental throughout your operations and assets. What we're seeing evolve is that those management systems are starting to merge into what is now being kind of headed as a sustainability management system. And so it has those same elements that you'll find in a safety management system, environmental management system, but it also adds these ESG lenses that may include social diversity. It may include enhanced data gathering capabilities or validation capabilities, which David referred, kind of alluded to. And so as far as like the practice of advancing your ESG programs, that's where we're seeing it like mechanically go to, is it's starting to become these sustainability management systems. But as far as the fallout of using ESG to help distinguish your business, either in performance or in your sustainability risk management, I'm curious, and I'd be curious to hear from Project Canary. A lot of my member companies, many of them work with Canary and Trustwell in trying to validate the sufficiency of their operational practices and their management programs as a way to distinguish and validate what they're saying. If this is now starting to be disclosed by every industry in the same way, but because of SEC requirements, does that change the ability for these companies to distinguish themselves using products like Trustwell? I'm curious where you guys may have been thinking on the topic.
I'll jump in on this quick. I don't think it changes. There's going to be differentiated issues between projects. It's just a function of the engineering and the function of the geology of the rock, where the rock is located, where you're trying to get that gas or oil to market. So there's fundamental differences in plays and how environmentally friendly they can be, and there will always be differentiation. And where we're headed is really the measurement economy, where emissions are measured instead of estimated. Especially, this is really hitting home with the new SEC rule. I think the point was made in a conference I was just at that, the IRS is not going to, depend upon estimates. They're going to need measurements to actually validate a company's ESG performance. So that's where we're headed. I do think there's always going to be differentiation that'll show up in the measurement, that'll show up in the total life cycle project emissions analysis that's conducted routinely when we start to think about these projects from the inception to actually the capital injection and building the plants and fields around them.
Yeah, and I'll just tag on to that there. As long as the assessment is built to account for best practices and not minimum regulatory requirements, there will always be room for differentiation. So one of the things we always stress when we're doing a trust well assessment or any of our environmental assessments is that we are not a regulatory audit. 90% of the time, the industry has some practice somewhere that supersedes or is above regulatory requirements. Now, there's spots, Pennsylvania water regulations, BLM requirements for reseeding in Wyoming, revegetation. Those are outstanding regulations. Difficult, but very, very outstanding, frankly, in what they require. But there's a lot of subjectivity across the U.S. for onshore production and continuing some of those best practices across the board. So as long as the assessment always accounts for best practices as opposed to minimum requirements, I agree with David that you'll see that ability for operators to differentiate.
Yeah, and just one more thing on this, the creativity of the industries, I'll go back to that. It's just incredible. You can have what in my mind might be a difficult project from an environmental standpoint, but you put some great minds to work on that, engineering behind that, and you can turn that project into a great environmental project. It just has to do with how you design it, how you execute.
I think the plan and the execution phases as well are going to be critical when you're talking about the policies, the structure that is a high level, kind of governing process. I agree that that's where it starts. The next follow-up will be plan and execution. And are you really executing on that policy? Are you following through with those commitments? And the devil's in the details, for lack of a better term.
Wendy, to pick up on the statement you made earlier about this really being about risk management. I mean, Josh, risk management, that starts in the planning phases. Usually by the time you realize you need to manage risk, it might be a little bit too late. So I hear you loud and clear on risk management and kind of ESG considerations being pushed further back into the concept and the planning phases. One thing that is not exactly related to the topic today, but I've heard it kind of referenced, sideswiped, if you will. It feels like we are, on the regulatory side, maybe being pushed to the point where carbon is going to be regulated and priced. Do you all have a...
Oh, sorry. I think the second half cut out. You said it feels like carbon's going to be regulated and priced. And then what did you ask?
Do you have a view on that?
Oh, view. I mean, ASPC does not have a formal position on that. I know some of our companies do, and some of our sister trades do. It's certainly something that's been looked at, off and on by policymakers. I don't know if it'll ever land as far as an official policy. It gets priced in other ways. If you look at, across the world, how, if you look at rec programs and things like that, people having to account. If you look at like Colorado's rules dealing with trying to meet targets, it winds up inadvertently getting priced in other ways. But I don't know that I see near term that it will happen in this Congress. But it's certainly, if you think about it in a traditional policy sense, but if you think about it sort of non-traditionally, you can find how people are putting value on emission reductions and those practices and being able to demonstrate success in those practices.
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that. I think, you're speaking of a carbon tax from the federal government or something along those lines, but I would argue that carbon already has a price. It's in the voluntary market. It is actively being traded today by many entities. It's a very wild market and one that is highly variable. I've heard terms of $1,500 down to $50 per ton, and then the previous administration was in the $20 range. So wide variety of what carbon is worth, and it's worth different values to different people. and for different reasons. And I think it's the market mechanism, the capitalism is a very good way to handle that in a way that maybe the federal government couldn't necessarily do. And I think there's a lot of effectiveness behind the voluntary carbon market. And I think that's going to get more and more acute in the coming years, especially as we increase things like measurement, things like reporting requirements. I think it's going to get much more scrutinized. These carbon offset projects are already being disputed in a number of different venues that maybe they aren't the big carbon offset project you thought it was. So I think there's just going to be a bright light shown on the voluntary carbon markets, and a lot of scrutiny is going to come behind those. So I think there's a lot more coming.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I get a little out of my league if we start talking about carbon tax. But I mean, the only thing I think we are all acutely aware that there will likely be significant change in European energy policy. And from that perspective, there is absolutely going to be carbon tax considerations. Whether they make their way here or not, good question.
Yeah, Europe is between, in an interesting point between the question of energy security and regulating carbon. To kind of latch onto a point that I heard Wendy and David refer to, that the market's already pricing carbon. I guess we see that in the verified sustainable, the premium that's being put on verified sustainable natural gas production and oil production, that purchasers are paying a premium if producers and midstream entities can show that product has been produced sustainably, and that goes back to using the data to verify that best practices are being adhered to, and I think that kind of is the heart of your business, isn't it, David and Josh?
Yeah, I was going to actually pipe in and say that I think what I've noticed, having worked, either within this industry or alongside this industry, for 20 years, is that there's always been this interest in probably any industry, but certainly the energy industry, to continue to reduce your footprint as a measure of sustainability and risk reduction. It's just good business to continue to do that. And you've seen technological advances usually accelerate that at a faster rate. But nonetheless, even over the course of my career, you've seen industry be able to produce more with less and less impact on from their operations, and companies are really very intentional about working with the communities that they are operating in, recognizing that they need to have a positive impact on those communities in order to have a successful business plan. And that's become very much, I think, just standard practice, and it continues to grow both in the environmental space, the social space, but just how you conduct your business. And I think that ESG is illustrating that trend, and it'll continue to grow in different ways, but certainly in not just emissions, not just the carbon equivalent emissions from operations, but all sorts of aspects from where an industry can impact a community or the environment. You're seeing this drive to continue to reduce that impact. And you're seeing that will out in a lot of what's being disclosed as far as, conservation practices, water recycling, water conservation, even workforce, enhancing workforce, so that can be more of a positive for a company's presence in a community.
So we have a question from one of our attendees here. Do you know of any ESG software that oil and gas companies are using? And I guess that would be software that takes in the data and somehow reports out according to certain metrics that would be considered ESG metrics.
My answer to that is yes. There's lots of software out there. I'm not going to name specific software companies, but there's a number of companies that have been focused on EHS management systems, reporting of air emissions, that have been around for decades now. They're very established. There's a number of them. I think that the platform is being rapidly expanded to include the social and governance aspects of ESG. which haven't been traditionally in the EHS, the compliance type platforms. But there's a lot of companies out there, big software companies, really focused on this issue of reporting, and there's a number of solutions out there, but I just can't list them off specifically in this venue. So
I will shamelessly put a plug for Project Canary's dashboard and our continuous monitors and the live emissions dashboard that you can see, and that is good software.
And I hear again this refrain in our conversation that much of what we're going to be doing that is now called ESG is composed of what we've already been doing, known as best practices, but maybe there's a little more of a push in it towards addressing social and governance issues that we haven't done a great job at in the past.
Let me interject here. I don't think we haven't done a good job with social and governance issues, Jack. I would reject that idea, but I think it's how they're reported and communicated externally has really been the challenge for companies.
I completely agree. I think what is new is the data and the way to collect the data and the way to present the data and how much data is getting presented. I mean, companies have been doing social risk assessments, for much longer than I've been working in the industry and working for that, but they haven't been necessarily, they're trying to find ways to capture data that can reflect the story and can demonstrate that performance. And I think you saw the same pattern. You saw that happen in safety, and then it became cyclical, right? The more data that they could find a way to generate, the more they could use the data to improve their own performance. And then you saw that evolve in environmental, in all the different aspects of environmental. And now I think you're seeing that evolve in the social is how can we take what we are doing and put a data metric to it so we can track it and advance it and communicate how we're doing it.
I'll throw in here, and this may rub some people the wrong way, it may be controversial, but I guess that, again, that's the spirit of a debate. I would argue the industry has a trust problem, whether that's self-inflicted or, merited or not, will depend on who you ask. But I think it's there. And there are cases that certain residents especially have why they wouldn't trust the industry. And so there is, whether or not the practices are everything that we are saying they are, there is a world where the trust issue is what needs to be solved. And that's where really, some of the independent assessment or just that data transparency that we were speaking about earlier, that's really where that becomes a big deal.
So let's kind of put some pragmatic edge on this. If we have all been doing ESG for some time, just under a different banner, and now we need to turn it into a narrative and kind of report out to show what we've been doing. For a manager of an energy business, like, what is step one? How do you orient your business actions, business activity, and your business reporting towards kind of leading with ESG, right? How do you transform the narrative to show that first and foremost, your focus is on environmental, social, and governance principles?
All right, I'll jump in on this one. I think the beginning is setting that bar and your key performance indicators in the executive level suite of the company. Typically, you set those metrics at production goals, operational type of goals. But I think we're seeing more and more that these KPIs will now include emissions reduction goals. It'll include things like the goals around social license to operate, your governance programs, your safety metrics. Once those are tied into executive compensation and compensation for the entire organization, it clarifies everybody into the point where everyone's focused on that in a very meaningful way. And if that's it's transparent and reported properly, it's very powerful and will drive an organization to improve.
Yeah, I would like to see a shift in mindset. A lot of times ESG can be thought of as a reactive metric, like we're on the defensive, we have to validate our ESG. I actually think ESG can be used proactively. I touched on this kind of at the very beginning. I would love to see it used as a tool and something that can be leveraged to really, push capital projects, to push equality of opportunity, things of that nature. It can really be used in a proactive light if it's thought about it that way and used that way. It's difficult. I won't pretend that it's not. But a shift in mindset from ESG as something that you're being forced to do to something that you can do to improve various elements of your operation, I think is a critical component. And I'd echo what David said. The OODA loop is a big part of this, right? Kind of observe, orient, decide, act. And I had to remember what it was. But really making sure you have a plan in place, you figure out the strategy, you execute, and then reevaluate and keep driving that continuous improvement. You've heard Wendy reference continuous improvement several times. Same concept.
Yeah, I mean, and it's going to sound a little contradictory, but actually, I think we're in alignment. Trying to defang ESG as something, and I'm totally stealing from a colleague of mine who uses the phrase, this is not about random acts of sustainability kindness. That's not what it's supposed to be. It is fundamentally about risk management. And if you are not performing well in the E space, in the S space, in the G space, you're not going to get to exist as a company long term, and you're a bad investment. And it's not to sound cold-hearted, but if you think about it in business terms, it really is just fundamentally good business practice. And so I think, step one is defanging it and recognizing this is not about just a cost center to spend a bunch of money on sustainability kindness. This is about doing your business well, so you get to keep doing your business, and you continue to be a viable investment. And so when you design it in, it's just business practice and just recognizing that. And I do think fundamental to that, even prior to whether, how you tie it to compensation or any of those questions, is really setting up your system so you can collect the data, so that you can make those determinations and demonstrate that you are identifying your risk, managing your risks, and that plan, do, check, act cycle. And so, I think one of the fundamentals is defanging it, and that it is a proactive step. It should be a normal course of business. And recognizing it as that lens. And I think step two is equipping yourself to be able to collect that data so you can build the programs and all the checkpoints to continue growing in your performance.
David and Wendy, I love that you all touched on leadership. A very good friend of mine, industry participant, and just a wonderful guy in general. He says, and he is very much focused on leadership as leaders set culture. Culture drives behavior. Behavior drives outcomes. And then outcomes determine whether that leader gets to continue to lead. So I appreciate the fact that you all are saying that this ESG, it starts with leadership, which is why we are the Irani Center. Our thrust at ESG is to train leaders, and it's not just company leaders. It might be business unit leaders. It might be, operations leaders within a business unit. So I wholeheartely agree with you. This is a matter of leadership. And I do want to address another question we have from the audience. This is really kind of right up the Project Canary alley. So will we see increased interest for orphan well monitoring and certification across the nation? Funding becoming available at state levels in my location to push plugging activities. David and Josh, I know that you all recently entered into an arrangement with another company to facilitate orphan well plugging. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll jump in there. This is near and dear to my heart. In a project I'm pushing very hard here at Project Canary, and it's very exciting because the Build Back Better bill built in methane reduction into the paradigm of calculating the emission reduction from a plugging and abandonment program. So our new technology, we just acquired a company called Eris Technologies. They have some of the most sensitive monitors I've seen in my career. I'm super excited to use these. And when you're talking plugging and abandonment, some of these wells, may be leaking very little. They may be covered over by soil and this and that. So it's very hard to detect some of the orphan wells, and a lot of times people don't even know exactly where they are. They could have a lat long, but they might be off by 10, 20 meters given the GPS back in the day that was used to measure that location. So you need very sensitive instruments to find these orphan wells and then verify that they've been plugged properly afterwards. And we're in a prime position in Project Canary with our new ARIS technology sensors and even our existing Canary X monitors to help the federal government and state governments with their orphan well programs and ensure that these wells are properly plugged and that there's no more emissions coming from them. So it's a great verification process that I'm super excited to be a part of.
And where did that effort originate? To kind of get back to the participant question, are we going to see increased interest in that type of activity beyond what you're doing at Project Canary? So what is driving people to use resource to address orphan wells, which they're non-productive. They'll never be productive. Well, mostly won't be productive again. So why spend money on them?
Well, one thing I want to add is that I've learned on this issue, there is a lot of misunderstanding of the terminology and inconsistent terminology. You hear folks conflate well abandonment, which is a regulatory compliant process, with orphan wells, which is when there's no operator in existence anymore for any, like they don't exist. There's no previous owner. You don't know who it is. And a lot of these orphan wells are really historic. They predate current regulatory programs that now have requirements in place to hopefully mitigate the risk of new orphan wells with a lot of our state programs. So Oklahoma, for example, has a very proactive program, bonding screening, and then a fund to help ensure they try to manage, the risk of creating new orphan wells. But nonetheless, there is some historic that sort of predate those regulations that the state is still trying to deal with. And that's true across the country. I think that's really been the challenge. Is it's not that there's a ton of new orphan wells happening. It's more, how do you ever get back at these historic ones? I mean, some of them, Pennsylvania is always an unknown case because some of their oil and gas development has been around since like the 1700s. Nobody has any clue who the operator is that should be responsible for those wells or how to even track them. And so how do you get, any source of funding when there's no production, there's no operator to go after, or even find these, as David made the point. So recently in the infrastructure package, the federal government decided to put a large pot of money to try to provide grant programs to states to allow states to go, not having to use their current funds and try to go and really find and address these orphan well programs. And so, I totally agree with David. I think that the more we can make sure that these are properly abandoned, there's no reason to have any emissions from any well if we can prevent it and properly abandon them. I would hate to, like I said, because of some of the confusion that you hear on the terminology, I would hate to see the money, used initially for something other than actually trying to find them and close them. And there is a lot of, there's a lot of conversation going around about trying to create other programs that would be, that would have to take place first before you could just properly close them. And so I would hope that that's where the funding will go and that's where the priority will be, and we won't waste the moment, given that the states have been given this opportunity for grant programs. But we'll see in how the money gets rolled out. I know that's the apprehension that we're hearing from states, is that people that are getting, I think, the goal mixed up may inadvertently prevent the money being spent to actually find and close these wells and make sure they're properly closed, as David spoke to.
Thank you.
Just to add on, then hark back to risk. Wendy mentioned risk at the beginning of this whole event, and when I was talking to state governments and the federal government about their orphan well programs, they really view that in that light of risk. And what they want help identifying from Project Canary is, what wells are leaking? what wells aren't leaking? How do I prioritize the use of this money so that it has the biggest bang for the buck? And I think, it's going to be impossible, even with the amount of money allocated, to plug every well that's out there immediately. It's going to take years and years. So let's tackle those ones that are truly emitting today, and let's get a program in place to measure and risk rank these orphan wells. So we're plugging the worst wells first, and those that are leaking very little or not at all, reevaluate that down, over time.
Well, I want to get back to one topic before we wind down that Josh mentioned early on. For our industry, it is the ever-present 800-pound gorilla, and that is access to capital. We're in a highly capital-intensive industry. So for those that are interested in leading businesses or leading organizations or units within a larger corporation, how does being compliant with ESG principles differentiate your business with respect to accessing capital markets? Josh, you brought it up, so I'm going to throw that one at you.
No, it's a very fair question. So let's start with the reality of what's happening. You just saw this from the the New York Pension Fund, where they divested from 21 companies. Now, I don't know how they came to the conclusion of who to divest from, but the fact is they did it. You see this push from university endowments constantly. They want to get out of oil and gas as a whole. You're seeing a wealth transfer in the U.S. to a younger generation that wants to shift their money elsewhere. Our encouragement is to really differentiate and not divest, but differentiate and put your money in the operators that care about what you care about. So if you truly believe that the younger generation wealth transfer and that the status quo essentially, or the minimum requirements have got us to the point to where we are today, where emissions are a problem, even if they are being addressed at some degree, where water usage, especially in the Western United States, is going to become much more prevalent, where land usage, operational impacts need to be mitigated better. All of those things, if you believe that needs to change and people are going to put their money there, then ESG will be a way for an operator to stand up and say, hey, we are separating ourselves from basic requirements, from the status quo. We are different, and this is how we're doing it, and to be able to actually validate it with data. It won't be a popularity contest. It won't be based on an opinion. It'll be based on data and practice and third-party assessment. And I think that'll be a valuable tool, whether it be to large capital providers or the individual investor themselves.
And so I would push the question a little bit further. I mean, we're talking about demand for publicly traded stock to a certain degree, but what about cost of capital? Do we have data points that ESG is improving cost of capital for those that are stepping out on it?
I saw Wendy come off mute. Would you like me to go first, Wendy, or do you have? Okay. I'll take a first stab at that. I would say yes, we have seen sustainability-linked bonds. Are they to the level that I think they need to be? Strongly depends. As a whole, I would argue no. Personally, I think there's a lot of room for that to grow. But I would argue rates on some of those bonds and or capital interest rates could very much be tied to that. And I do think operators with ESG have seen some reduction to date. Some have, others have not. But I think that's a very broad market with rapid room for expansion.
Wendy, what were you thinking?
So, I mean, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it's, if you look at the primary investors in energy space, it's not really about a feel-good act of kindness, to the environment. It's about risk management. And so they want to know, can the business deliver the plan that they're telling me that they're going to be, that's their plan for this next year for this capital spend. And so your ESG performance can help demonstrate how you are resilient against some of these risks, and you can deliver the plan and drive returns. I think that's fundamentally what has changed. Certainly it's gotten louder and calls for more data and transparency. But what fundamentally changed that I saw with energy investors is, where companies used to be rewarded on a growth model, it's really switched, and they want to see returns. And so that is, do I have discipline in spending my capital wisely, and am I resilient? against risk. And ESG is part of that message of how you answer those questions.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing, Jack, if that's okay. I think when I'm looking at new projects coming down the pipe for oil and gas, the return on investment calculation has fundamentally shifted in the past few years. That social cost of carbon, the cost of methane is being included in the return on investment calculations now, and you're seeing it weighted much more heavily than previously. And I think that's manifesting itself in better projects being approved and funded.
I hear all three of you saying that ESG is really a function of a train of thought driven by economics, by fiscal risk management. And the more time I spend with smart people like you guys, I do see that it's less of a feel-good series of actions and more something that managers of energy businesses can and do need to approach from a fiscal standpoint. I appreciate you all spending valuable time with us today. I know each of you is far busier than any of us would care to be, but there's a blessing in that. In closing, I want to again mention the fact that in mid-April, the Irani Center for Energy Solutions, we're offering our first cohort of a certificate program, an executive professional development program focused on energy ESG leadership. David and Josh are going to be instructors in that course, along with a handful of other very gifted people. We are going to be representing the generalist perspective as an introduction to energy ESG, and then we're going to drill down on the E, the S, and the G, and the leadership aspects of it. We welcome any questions you have about the program. We welcome your participation. Please reach out at the contact information at the bottom of the slide that's being shown now. The QR code will take you to the website that'll give you more information. And we're very excited and grateful to participate in the conversation that is reframing this concept of ESG away from something that's driven by malicious forces even, but rather reframing it towards this is a fiscally driven, rationally economic exercise that is going to improve our industry, that is going to improve our results, and ensure that oil and gas production remains a valuable and long-term element of our energy portfolio. So thank you all for your time, your attention, and please reach out with any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you.